Forget every monster you thought you knew. What we found in those frozen woods wasn't just a predator, it was a curse, and it knew our names. I don't know exactly when everything started to go wrong on that damn operation in the frozen woods near the Montana-Alberta border, but I remember the precise moment I truly felt that something had been watching us long before our patrol found the missing soldiers. Something that didn't breathe like a human, didn't move like a human, but left in the air that damp, acrid smell of warm flesh mixed with stale sweat and disturbed earth, an odor that stuck to the back of my throat, as if trying to warn me that nothing I believed about local predators was enough to explain what walked in the darkness. We were sent as reinforcement because 3 military personnel from Charlie Platoon had vanished during a reconnaissance mission in a remote stretch of the Superior National Forest on the American side. On the Canadian side of the border, they had also reported strange sounds and impossible to catalogue tracks in recent weeks. Neither I nor my comrades believed in the supernatural, but even on that first night, I noticed the forest was too quiet. No owls, no insects, none of that typical rustling of deer moving through the undergrowth. Nothing. Just a silence that seemed to press on my chest as if it had weight. The cold was a constant biting companion. It seeped into your bones, numbing your fingers, blurring the edges of your thoughts. Every breath was a plume of white, visible evidence of the life trying to persist in this desolate expanse. We were a small unit, hardened by countless deployments, but this was different. There was no enemy combatant to track, no clear objective other than to locate and recover, and recovery was starting to feel like a naive hope. Our boots crunched on the frozen ground, a monotonous rhythm that was supposed to be comforting, a sign of our unified progress. But tonight each crunch felt like a drumbeat, echoing too loudly in the suffocating quiet. Sergeant Moore, a man whose face was etched with the grim lines of too many winters and too many wars, led the way. His usual stoicism was a mask tonight, one I could see was starting to crack at the edges. Thompson, usually the jester of the group, was unusually subdued, his eyes darting into the impenetrable darkness beyond the reach of our headlamps, reflecting a nervousness I rarely saw in him. Private Miller, young and eager, kept his weapon tighter than usual, his movements jerky, reactive to every imagined sound. And me? I just felt it. A prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a sense of being observed, not by a curious deer or a cautious bear, but by something with an awareness, a patience that bordered on malevolence. We moved slowly, deliberately, the beam of our headlamps cutting weak tunnels through the dense snow-laden pines. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of pine and frozen earth, but underneath it all, I started to pick up on it. Faint at first, a metallic tang of something organic, then a deeper, more unsettling note, like a wet animal pelt left out in the rain, mixed with the sharp, almost industrial stench of stale, unwashed sweat. It was wrong. It didn't belong here. This was a wilderness, pristine and unforgiving, not a place for such a putrid, artificial smell. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it away. Maybe it was a distant animal carcass, something decaying beneath a blanket of snow. But the smell was too persistent, too specific. It clung to the air around us, a silent, invisible companion. It wasn't a strong, overwhelming odor, not yet. It was a subtle whisper on the wind, a suggestion that something alien had passed this way, leaving its signature. And the more I focused on it, the more I felt that unseen presence, that cold, calculating gaze from the blackness that surrounded us. Moore paused, his hand raised, signaling for us to stop. We froze, our breath still hanging in the frigid air. He didn't say anything, but his head tilted slightly, listening. I heard nothing but the pounding of my own heart against my ribs and the distant, almost imperceptible hum of the wind through the topmost branches. Then a shiver, not from the cold, ran down my spine. The smell intensified for a fleeting moment, a ghost of a warning. It wasn't just a smell, it felt like a silent challenge, a claim being staked. He lowered his hand and we continued, but the easy rhythm of our patrol was broken. Now every step felt heavy, every shadow held a potential threat. The forest seemed to hold its breath with us, waiting. And that smell, that impossible, acrid whisper on the wind clung to me, a silent promise of what was yet to come. I couldn't shake it. that faint metallic odor of warm flesh and stale, rancid sweat, a whisper on the wind that no one else seemed to notice, but the narrator couldn't shake. It was a secret, an intimate dread shared only between me and the unseen. The pervasive foul smell, initially a subtle prickle at the back of my throat, was no longer ignorable. It thickened in the air around us as we pushed deeper into the tree line, a cloying blend of wet fur, stale sweat, damp earth, and something else, something primal and profoundly wrong. It was metallic, like old blood, yet also organic, like unwashed skin after a long, desperate hunt. It was the scent of predator, yes, but not like any I'd ever encountered. Not bear, not wolf, not mountain lion. This was different, almost personal. Anyone else getting that? Thompson's voice was low, strained, cutting through the heavy silence. He sniffed the air, a grimace on his face. Smells like a zoo after a rainstorm, but with something else thrown in. Miller, walking behind me, shifted uncomfortably. Yeah, I thought it was just me, kind of sickly sweet almost. Like something rotten, but still alive. Sergeant Moore, ever practical, simply grunted. Probably a bear den nearby, or a fresh kill. This is their territory, boys. Don't get spooked by a little musk. His words were meant to reassure, but the way his flashlight beam swept the dark pines with an almost frantic energy betrayed his true feelings. He was trying to rationalize it, to impose order on a sensation that defied easy explanation. But the smell wasn't just a little musk. It was a pervasive, suffocating presence, making my stomach churn. I kept my silence, but my nose twitched, trying to pinpoint the source, to dissect its components. It was like no animal I'd ever tracked. There was the undeniable earthiness of the forest floor, the sharp tang of pine needles, the crispness of the frigid air, but superimposed on that was this sickening symphony of decay and vitality. It was the smell of fear, yes, but also of hunger, a wet, almost humid smell, incongruous with the dry, freezing air. It clung to our gear, our uniforms, a silent contamination. As we navigated a particularly dense section of ancient firs, their branches heavy with snow, we started seeing them. Not clear tracks, not distinct paw prints, but disturbances. Branches snapped high off the ground, too high for a deer, too cleanly broken for a bear thrashing through. Patches of snow were displaced, as if something heavy had landed there, then pushed off again with immense force. There was no coherent pattern, just isolated instances of unnatural disruption. Moore paused again. His boot, nudging a particularly thick branch that lay on the ground, snapped clean through. "Looks fresh," he murmured, more to himself than to us. He swept his light higher along the trunk of a nearby pine, and then I saw it. A faint, dark smear on the bark, too high for most animals, accompanied by shallow, vertical gouges. Not deep enough to be a territorial claw mark from a bear, but long, thin, almost like a scrape from a rake, only much more powerful. "Someone really doesn't like this tree," Miller said, trying for levity, but his voice cracked slightly. Thompson, his eyes narrowed, circled the tree cautiously. "Or something really heavy used it as a scratching post. But look at these, they're too neat for a bear, and too high." Moore didn't reply immediately. He ran a gloved hand over the disturbed snow at the base of the tree, then stood up slowly. His gaze was fixed on the upper branches, then drifted to the surrounding darkness. He was trying to make sense of something that refused to fit into his established framework of the natural world. I could see the gears turning, the logical explanations failing one by one. The scent intensified subtly then, a momentary gust of that awful, warm flesh and stale sweat cocktail, making me instinctively pull my scarf higher over my nose. It felt like a warning, a territorial marker. Whatever was out there, whatever had left these impossible signs, was still very much in the vicinity. It was watching. And it was waiting. Moore finally turned to us, his face a grim mask. "All right, keep your eyes open. This isn't a regular animal, whatever it is. Something's off." He then quickly changed the subject, directing us to spread out slightly, to keep a wider perimeter of observation. But the narrator saw the subtle shift in his eyes, a flicker of something akin to fear, or perhaps a dawning, terrible understanding. He hadn't just seen disturbed snow. He had seen a challenge, and the silence that followed his words felt less like a lack of sound and more like a held breath. The uneasy feeling that had begun with the unnatural silence and the unsettling scent solidified into palpable dread when we found the tracks. We had been moving through a patch of partially thawed ground, where the underlying soil was soft enough to take impressions, but the frost had returned, hardening the marks in place, preserving them as if in amber. Sergeant Moore, ever the tracker, stopped dead, his boot inches from the first undeniable sign. He knelt, his powerful frame a dark silhouette against the snow-dusted earth, and pointed. My heart hammered against my ribs. They were huge, far too large for any wolf I'd ever seen, even the largest timber wolves. And they weren't the splayed, paw-like prints of a bear. These were different, broader, longer, with distinct, almost human-like digits. 5 of them, clearly defined, tapering to blunt points. Not claws, but something harder, more akin to thick nails. The heel was substantial, heavy, leaving a deep indentation. "What in God's name?" Thompson breathed, his voice barely a whisper. He knelt beside Moore, tracing the outline with a gloved finger, disbelief etched on his face. The most unnerving aspect, however, wasn't just the size or the shape. It was the stride. The prints were spaced in a way that suggested a bipedal gait. 2 distinct impressions, one after the other, with a long, impossibly wide gap in between, indicative of a creature walking on 2 legs. And then, abruptly, the pattern would change, morphing into a wider, 4-limbed stride, before transitioning back again. It was as if whatever made these marks could fluidly switch between walking upright and running on all 4s. Moore's face, usually a study in granite, hardened further. His jaw was clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He didn't say anything, but his eyes, when they met mine, held a primal terror he usually reserved for combat. It was the look of a man trying to deny with his eyes what his body already knew. These weren't animal tracks, not in any conventional sense. "Maybe it's a hoax," Miller suggested, his voice high-pitched with strain. "Some local playing games, a custom prosthetic or something?" Thompson shook his head slowly. "A hoax? In this weather? Out here? For what purpose? And look at the depth. This thing is heavy, real heavy, and it's not dragging its feet, it's moving with purpose." He stood up, sweeping his flashlight beam in a wide arc, as if expecting the owner of the prints to suddenly materialize from the shadows. I walked the length of the track we'd found, my heart sinking with each impossible print. The detail was incredible. The pads of the digits were visible, the slight ridges of skin. It was undeniably anatomical, organic, but it was undeniably wrong. The sheer power implied by the depth of the impressions, the way the creature had dug into the hardened mud, spoke of immense physical strength, and the intelligence in its movement, the calculated alteration of its gait, hinted at something far beyond instinct. This wasn't a lumbering beast, it was a hunter, precise and deliberate. The acrid smell intensified, a sharp metallic note now dominating the stale sweat and wet fur. It clung to the air directly above the tracks, as if the creature had just passed by, leaving its scent as a mocking signature. A shiver, colder than the icy wind, traced its way down my spine. The forest, once merely quiet, now felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to catch up, to realize the true nature of what we were following. We gathered around Moore, our faces grim under the harsh glare of our headlamps. No one spoke. The unspoken question hung heavy in the frigid air. What kind of animal leaves prints like this? What kind of animal can walk upright like a man, then drop to 4 legs with fluid grace? What kind of animal blends human and beast so seamlessly, so terrifyingly? Moore finally pushed himself to his feet, his gaze sweeping the tree line once more. His voice, when he spoke, was low, tight, almost a growl itself. "All right, we follow it. Keep your intervals. No chances. Thompson, you're on point. Miller, your rear guard. Watch your 6. He didn't offer any explanation, didn't try to rationalize it further. He had seen the evidence, undeniable and terrifying. His silence was more damning than any words. We all felt it, the dawning, awful understanding. This wasn't just a mission anymore. It was a hunt, and we were no longer sure who was the hunter and who was the prey. A chilling, almost human-like print in the hardened mud, too perfect, too impossible, seemed to stare up at us, a silent challenge in the face of our dwindling resolve. It was an invitation to a game we hadn't asked to play. The tracks led us deeper into the labyrinthine embrace of the forest, the frozen trees clawing at the perpetually twilight sky. Each print was a testament to impossible anatomy, a stark reminder of the unknown that now hunted these woods. Our pace had slowed to a crawl, every shadow scrutinized, every distant rustle sending a jolt of adrenaline through our veins. The air, already thick with dread, was now laced with an almost imperceptible scent of iron, a whisper of what was to come. Then we found it. A clearing opened up, a small expanse of pristine, unbroken snow, illuminated by the pale, ghost-like glow of the half-moon struggling through the clouds. In the very center, stark against the immaculate white, was a vivid, horrifying splash of crimson, fresh blood. My breath hitched in my throat. It was a violent, abrupt splotch, a dark, viscous pool that hadn't yet fully frozen, steaming faintly in the frigid air. The color was shocking, a cruel burst of life against the monochrome landscape of death. But what made my stomach churn, what made the hairs on my arms stand on end, was the complete absence of any accompanying marks. There were no drag marks in the snow, no struggle implied, no churned-up earth, no broken branches leading to or from the site. No footprints, human or otherwise, disturbed the snow around the pool. It was as if the blood had simply materialized, dropped from the sky, a cruel painting on a pristine canvas. It was a stark, interrupted smear, as if a victim had been seized mid-action, or, more disturbingly, as if the attacker had shifted form in the midst of its brutal work, disappearing without a trace. Sergeant Moore was the first to reach it, his steps heavy, almost reluctant. He knelt, his eyes scanning the impossible scene, his face a mask of grim confusion. He touched a gloved finger to the crimson pool, then brought it close to his nose. "Still warm," he murmured, his voice tight with barely contained revulsion. "Very fresh." Thompson gagged, stepping back from the sight, his face pale in the reflected moonlight. "My God, what happened here? There's nothing, no body, no tracks." Miller, usually quick with a theory, was silent, his gaze fixed on the blood with a morbid fascination. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped his rifle. The raw, violent nature of the scene, combined with its impossible cleanliness, was truly unsettling. It defied logic, defied all conventional understanding of a predator attack. I circled the bloodstain slowly, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm. The peculiar distribution of the splatter was disturbing. It wasn't a wide, chaotic spray, but a concentrated pool, with smaller, more delicate flecks fanning out from one side, as if a creature had torn into its prey with surgical precision, then simply vanished. Or even worse, had become the snow itself, dissolving into the landscape. But that was a thought too absurd, too horrifying to entertain. The acrid smell was back, stronger here, mingling with the coppery tang of fresh blood. It was the scent of carnage, yes, but also of something calculated, something deliberate. This wasn't a clumsy animal kill. This was a precise, terrifying act, executed by something that understood its environment, something that knew how to erase its presence. The silence of the forest, which had once felt merely oppressive, now felt predatory. It was not an absence of sound, but an intentional hush, a held breath, as if the woods themselves were complicit in this horror. We were deep in its territory now, far from any semblance of civilization, isolated and vulnerable. And whatever had done this was still out there, somewhere in the suffocating darkness, watching us, assessing us, perhaps even playing with us. Moore stood up, his gaze sweeping the tree line, his expression unreadable. He didn't have answers, and for the first time, his usual composure seemed to falter. The crimson stain on the pristine white snow was a stark, brutal signpost, guiding us deeper into a nightmare. It was a promise, a chilling invitation to witness the full extent of its terror. A drop of warm blood melted a small, perfect circle in the snow, like an eye staring back at them, a silent, crimson accusation that we were trespassing on sacred, deadly ground. The crimson stain, a brutal exclamation mark on the snow, had shattered any lingering illusions of a routine search and rescue. We were no longer looking for lost soldiers. We were tracking a ghost, a phantom predator that left impossible footprints and vanished without a trace after its kills. The air hummed with a tension so thick you could almost taste it, a metallic tang of fear and anticipation. We moved away from the clearing, desperate to put distance between ourselves and that unnerving pool of blood. But the forest refused to release us from its grip. The silence, previously so profound, was now interrupted by the whispers of the wind through the pines, a sound that seemed to carry hidden meanings, veiled threats. Then it came. A sound so utterly primal, so deeply unsettling that it froze the blood in my veins. It began as a profound guttural rumble, a low, resonant growl that vibrated through the frozen earth, rising from the very depths of the forest. It was an animal sound, undeniably, powerfully so, like a bear's territorial warning or a wolf's challenge. But then, as it climbed in intensity, something horrifyingly unnatural happened. The growl morphed. Subtly, insidiously, the pure animalistic roar became something else. It gained a strange cadence, a guttural inflection that seemed to shape itself, to attempt to vocalize. It was like a beast trying to form words, a monstrous mimicry of human speech trapped within a predatory snarl. A series of distorted, rasping sounds, struggling for articulation almost forming a name. "Thompson!" The sound tore through the air, ragged and raw, a twisted echo that wasn't quite a human call, but wasn't entirely an animal sound either. It was both, horrifyingly blended, a grotesque symphony of beast and man. Thompson, walking a few paces ahead of me, stumbled, dropping his rifle with a clatter that reverberated too loudly in the sudden echoing silence that followed the growl. He spun around, his face ashen, eyes wide with terror. Did you hear that? It called my name!" His voice was a strangled whisper, laced with pure, unadulterated fear. "It called my name. I swear to God." Miller, who had instinctively raised his weapon, lowered it slowly, his mouth agape. He looked from Thompson to Moore, then to me, his confusion battling with his terror. Moore, usually the unflappable rock, stood rigid, his head tilted, listening intently to the absence of sound. His eyes, usually so sharp, were distant, struggling to reconcile what he'd just heard with everything he knew. I would have laughed, would have dismissed it as a trick of the mind, the product of stress and exhaustion, if the sound hadn't been so real, so close, and so profoundly wrong. It was a violation of the natural order, a sound that should not exist. A predatory beast attempting to speak. It defied every instinct, every scientific explanation. Yet the guttural, twisted inflection had been undeniable. The primal fear that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted, a cold wave washing over me, making me shiver violently, and it wasn't from the biting cold. The forest seemed to press in on us, its shadows deepening, taking on menacing forms. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of dry leaves became amplified, a potential prelude to another impossible sound, another terrifying revelation. The wind, which had been carrying that acrid smell, now seemed to whisper insidious secrets, the memory of that almost worded growl hanging heavy in the frigid air. We picked up Thompson's rifle, our movements stiff, our eyes darting nervously. The cold deepened, or perhaps it was just the psychological impact of that unholy sound. My skin crawled, my muscles tensed, ready to react to an unseen threat that defied all logic. What kind of creature could make such a sound? What kind of intelligence lay behind that monstrous vocalization? Moore finally broke the silence, his voice rough. "Keep moving. Stay sharp. Don't fall behind." But his words lacked conviction, hollow against the echoing memory of that growl. He swept his flashlight beam frantically through the surrounding darkness, his movements betraying a growing desperation. The growl faded, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake, but the narrator felt a pair of unseen eyes, intelligent and malevolent, tracking their every move from the depths of the shadows. We were no longer just being watched, we were being assessed, played with, tormented, and the hunter, invisible yet omnipresent, was savoring every moment of our fear. The echo of that impossible growl, half beast, half word, resonated in our ears, a haunting soundtrack to our deepening dread. Rationality, once our most reliable tool, had deserted us. We moved like ghosts, our once confident strides replaced by hesitant, fearful steps, each soldier lost in their own nightmare. The forest, now fully dark, was a living, breathing entity of menace, its every shadow concealing a potential horror. The feeling of being stalked intensified with every passing minute. It was no longer a vague apprehension, but a crushing certainty. We were prey. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, every branch groaning under the weight of snow became a potential threat, sending spasms of terror through our already frayed nerves. Our headlamps, once beacons of reassuring light, now seemed to carve out small vulnerable pockets in an immense hostile darkness, highlighting our isolation rather than providing safety. Thompson, still visibly shaken by the growl that had called his name, kept muttering to himself, his eyes wide and unfocused. Miller, younger and less experienced with this kind of psychological warfare, was trembling almost constantly, his weapon held in a white-knuckled grip. Even more, our stalwart leader had a subtle tremor in his hands when he raised his map to check our bearings. The cold was biting, but it was the unseen presence, the silent hunter, that truly chilled us to the bone. As we navigated a particularly dense thicket, our beams cut through the gloom, illuminating a disturbing pattern on the trees. Fresh, deep claw marks scored the bark of several towering pines. They weren't the broad, messy scrapes of a bear, nor the sharp, thin slashes of a mountain lion. These were long, parallel gouges, incredibly deep, as if whatever had made them possessed immense strength and perfectly honed talons. And they were high. Far too high for any known animal to reach comfortably, even standing on its hind legs. Some were at eye level with me, others much higher, suggesting a creature of truly imposing stature. "Look at these," I whispered, pointing my light at a series of 5 distinct parallel gashes that ran nearly a meter up the trunk of an ancient fir. The wood was freshly torn, sap weeping from the wounds, indicating a very recent passage. Moore examined them, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Whatever it is, it's not small, and it's not playing around. These marks, they're like it was testing its strength, or marking its territory." Miller let out a small choked sound. "It's like fingers, giant, twisted fingers." We pressed on, the silence punctuated only by the nervous shuffle of our boots and the heavy thud of our own hearts. A little further, we stumbled upon a small concealed hollow that had clearly been a campsite. It was one of the missing soldiers' makeshift shelters, still containing some scattered gear. But it wasn't the scene of a typical struggle. The tent was ripped, not torn from a frantic fight, but slashed with an almost surgical precision, as if by immense, sharp blades. Equipment was strewn about, but not in a panicked mess. A backpack lay open, its contents spilled, but nothing seemed broken or violently destroyed. It was a ransacked site, yes, but one that suggested a calculated, precise demolition, not a chaotic encounter. It was as if the attacker had taken its time, surveyed the scene, and then coolly, deliberately, rendered it unusable. "No blood," Thompson whispered, his voice hoarse, shining his light into the ripped tent. "No signs of a struggle. Nothing. How could they just vanish?" But I knew. We all knew, deep down. They hadn't vanished. They had been taken. Not by an animal, not by a human. By something that moved with an intelligence and a predatory grace that defied definition. The eerie precision of the destruction, the lack of struggle, suggested an overwhelming force, an attack so swift and brutal that resistance was impossible. As we stood there, surrounded by the remnants of a vanished life, the silence of the forest was suddenly broken by a sound, a faint rhythmic thudding. It was too heavy for a rabbit, too deliberate for a deer. It was almost like footsteps, heavy and measured, emerging from the deepest shadows ahead, then fading, then returning, circling us unseen. It was a sound that told us the hunter wasn't just observing, it was playing, and we were caught in its game. The rhythmic thudding, the sound of impossible footsteps circling us, faded as quickly as it had begun, leaving an even more profound, terrifying silence in its wake. Our nerves were frayed, stretched to their breaking point. Every breath felt like a luxury we couldn't afford. The cold had seeped beyond our bones, chilling our very souls, a mirror to the icy dread that now held us in its grip. We were no longer searching for the missing. We were desperately trying to avoid becoming them. The tracks continued, leading us through a maze of snow-covered undergrowth and gnarled ancient trees. The scent, that terrible mixture of wet fur, stale sweat and warm blood, was now an oppressive fog, burning our nostrils, a constant reminder of the unseen horror that shadowed our every step. Then we found him. A small clearing bathed in the anemic glow of the struggling moon opened up before us. In its center, kneeling, was a figure. He was naked, his skin a ghastly pale against the stark white snow, shivering violently in the sub-zero temperatures. He was one of the missing soldiers from Charlie Platoon, Staff Sergeant Miller. But it wasn't him. Not truly. His body was emaciated, almost skeletal, yet paradoxically, his muscles were unnaturally taut, ridged beneath his skin as if stretched to their breaking point. His skin, once healthy, was now pulled so tightly over his frame that it seemed translucent, almost cracking. His nails. Dear God, his nails. They were elongated, yellowed, sharp, curling slightly like talons. They looked too hard, too thick to be human. He didn't acknowledge our presence at first, his head bowed, his body racked with tremors. But as our headlamp beams converged on him, he slowly, excruciatingly, lifted his head. His eyes. They weren't human. They glowed with an eerie, predatory amber, reflecting our lights with an unsettling intelligence, a feral glint that spoke of raw instinct and something far older, far darker. My stomach lurched. There was something terribly wrong with his jaw. It was subtly distorted, elongated, like a muzzle trying to form itself. The skin around it stretched taut, almost tearing. His mouth hung slightly agape, revealing teeth that seemed too long, too pointed, too numerous. His breathing was heavy, labored, a deep, resonant sound that was physically impossible for a human. It was a guttural rasp, so profound it vibrated within my own chest, an unholy symphony of human suffering and animalistic instinct. Sergeant Moore, despite the shock, reacted with instinctual command. "Miller! Staff Sergeant Miller! Are you all right? What happened?" He started to move forward cautiously, his weapon held at the ready, his face a grim mask of concern and confusion. But as Moore took a step closer, the soldier recoiled, letting out a sound that tore through the freezing air. It wasn't a scream of pain, nor a cry for help. It wasn't a human sound at all. But it wasn't a pure animalistic howl either. It was something in between, a guttural, half-formed moan that carried within it the echoes of anguish and a terrifying, dawning bestiality. It was a sound that made the hair on my arms stand on end, a sound that resonated with the forgotten stories I'd heard as a child about creatures that walked under the full moon in the Appalachian Mountains. My mind, despite my desperate attempts to fight it, screamed a word, a forbidden name, ancient and terrible, that had no place in our modern, rational world. I didn't want to think it, didn't want to acknowledge the monstrous truth that was unfolding before my eyes, but the word surged in my mind with brutal force, insistent, undeniable. And when Moore, his face a mixture of horror and confusion, turned to us and asked, "What in God's name do you think is happening?" I almost let it slip, I almost said it, werewolf. As Moore reached out, a low, ominous crackling sound, like dry branches snapping under immense pressure, emanated from the kneeling soldier's joints. His body began to convulse violently, a terrifying prelude to something unspeakable. The crackling sound from the kneeling soldier intensified, a sickening symphony of bone and sinew tearing and reforming. His body contorted, a grotesque, horrifying dance that defied all laws of anatomy. His back arched, skin stretching, ripping along the spine, revealing dark, coarse hair pushing through, his limbs elongated, muscles bulging, veins throbbing beneath the taut skin. The transformation was agonizing, brutal, and utterly mesmerizing in its terror. Before our horrified eyes, Staff Sergeant Miller, or what remained of him, dropped to all fours with a wet, sickening thud. His humanity was dissolving, replaced by something ancient and monstrous. His hands, once human, flattened, hardened, morphing into powerful paws tipped with those terrifying, elongated talons. His face elongated, his teeth sharpened into predatory fangs. He was still shaking, but now it was a primal, twitching energy, not fear. He was becoming a beast. Just as this grotesque metamorphosis reached its peak, a blur of impossibly fast motion erupted from the dense tree line behind him. My heart leaped into my throat, a cold spike of dread piercing me. It was a silhouette, huge and powerful, moving with a speed that defied logic. Forepaws first, digging into the snow, sending plumes of white powder into the air. Then, with an astonishing, fluid grace, it shifted, rising onto two massive, powerfully muscled legs. It was colossal. Over 2 meters tall in its upright stance, its bulk casting a terrifying shadow over the already transformed soldier. Its body was a mass of impossible muscles, rippling and flexing under dark, matted fur that glistened with moisture, reflecting the pale moonlight like polished obsidian. Its snout was long, powerfully built, ending in a muzzle bristling with teeth that were almost human at the base, but terminated in curved, razor-sharp carnivorous points. But it was the eyes that truly cemented the horror. They glowed with the same amber light as the soldiers, but in them was not just feral instinct, but a malevolent, conscious intelligence. A cruel, calculating malice that analyzed us, assessed us, as if we were nothing more than fresh meat. It was the gaze of a hunter who knew exactly what it was doing and exactly how to enjoy it. Thompson, his nerve completely shattered, raised his rifle and fired. The shot cracked through the frigid air, a desperate, futile attempt to break the nightmare. But he missed. The bullet tore harmlessly into the snow near the creature's immense feet. The beast barely flinched, its head tilting slightly, as if acknowledging the pathetic attempt, then dismissing it. It didn't immediately attack. Instead, it inclined its massive head slightly towards us, a chilling, almost curious gesture. It sniffed the air, that rough, ragged breath, a mixture of human gasps and animalistic snorts, filling the clearing with its foul, acrid scent. It was assessing us, sizing up its new prey, recognizing our fear, our vulnerability. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned its terrible gaze back to the soldier, who was still completing his horrific transformation. The soldier, now a snarling quadrupedal nightmare, began to writhe even faster, bones audibly cracking, skin rupturing along his back and limbs, as if responding to a silent telepathic command from the larger creature. The transformation was accelerating, intensifying, guided by the monstrous presence that had just arrived. A low, rumbling growl, unlike anything I had ever heard, vibrated through the air. It was deep, powerful, and utterly devoid of anything human. It was the sound of primordial hunger, a warning and a promise. It spoke of ancient terror, of a predator refined over millennia. This wasn't just an animal. This was a force of nature, twisted and made sentient by something unholy. The main creature, after a moment of terrifying assessment, let out that low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the narrator's very bones, a sound that sealed our fate and ushered in the true nightmare. The rumbling growl of the colossal creature echoed through the clearing, a sound so profound it didn't just vibrate the air, but seemed to resonate within my very bones, shaking my internal organs. It was a declaration of dominance, a warning, and a promise of unimaginable violence. My light, trembling in my hand, was fixed on its monstrous form, trying to reconcile the impossible details. More than 2 meters tall, dark, wet fur, muscles that defied known biology, and a snout that was both canine and eerily human. The teeth, glinting wetly in the anemic moonlight, were things of pure nightmare. But the eyes, those terrifying amber eyes, they weren't merely predatory. They held a conscious, strategic cruelty. The malice was calculated, the hunger primordial, but tempered with an intellect that knew exactly what it was doing, exactly how to prolong our torment. It wasn't just a beast. It was an entity, a thinking hunter, playing with its food. It didn't attack us directly. Instead, its terrible gaze, filled with an ancient malevolence, shifted from us to the soldier still contorting on the snow. The transformed soldier, now fully on all fours, his body grotesque, a caricature of human form, responded instantly. Bones audibly snapped and shifted, skin ripping to accommodate new muscle and fur. He was no longer Staff Sergeant Miller, but a hunched, snarling shadow. his eyes reflecting the same amber glow as the larger creature. He was completing his transformation, becoming one of them. "What are we doing?" Thompson screamed, his voice high-pitched with terror, his previous shot having done nothing but draw more attention. "Moore, we have to move. It's turning him." Moore, his face pale but resolute, finally made a decision. "Open fire. Focus on the smaller one. Try to create an opening." His voice was strained, but the command was clear. We unleashed a volley of rifle fire at the newly transformed soldier. Bullets ripped into his hulking form, drawing guttural snarls and howls of pain. But he didn't fall. Instead, he lunged forward, not at the larger creature, but at us, with a feral roar that was undeniably animalistic, yet carried a hint of human rage. He was faster, stronger, more resilient than any animal should be. His movements a horrifying blur of teeth and claws. My mind raced, struggling against the tide of impossible reality. Transformation. The word, once whispered, then almost uttered, now hammered against the inside of my skull with undeniable force. This wasn't a trick of the light, not a delusion. We were witnessing a living, breathing nightmare, a creature that could shed its human skin and become a monster. And the larger one, the Alpha, was its puppet master, its progenitor. As we fired, trying desperately to hold back the onrushing horror that was once a man, the larger creature remained unnervingly still. Its eyes never left us, a silent, terrifying judgment. It watched us struggle, watched its newly forged brethren attack, its silent presence more terrifying than any direct assault. It was orchestrating our terror, enjoying our desperation. Then, from the deep, impenetrable shadows at the edge of the clearing, a second set of glowing amber eyes appeared, then a third, faint, distant, but undeniable. They were watching, observing, just like the larger creature. My blood ran cold, turning to ice in my veins. It wasn't just one, it wasn't just two, it was a group. They were multiplying. They had been converting the missing soldiers, turning them into these abominations. We weren't just facing a single monster. We were facing a pack, and we were surrounded. The chilling realization that we were not alone, that a multitude of these unspeakable things watched from the shadows, amplified the terror 1,000-fold. The second set of glowing amber eyes, cold and patient, confirmed our worst fears. We were trapped in a nightmare, besieged by primal hunger, and our fight for survival had just begun. The realization that we were facing not one, but multiple of these abominations, watching us from the depths of the shadows, shattered any remaining semblance of military composure. Our retreat became a desperate, chaotic flight. Sergeant Moore, despite the terror, tried to maintain some order, yelling commands, coordinating suppressing fire. But panic was a palpable, suffocating entity, thicker than the frigid air itself. Fall back to the main trail, keep firing." Moore's voice was hoarse, strained, but he kept his ground, covering our retreat, his M4 spitting fire into the advancing, transformed soldier, who, despite taking multiple hits, continued its relentless, snarling charge. The larger creature, the progenitor of this nightmare, moved with impossible speed, a dark blur of fur and muscle. It didn't follow us directly on the trail. Instead, it moved through the dense forest flanking us, effortlessly switching between 2 and 4 legs. One moment it was a towering bipedal silhouette, leaping over fallen logs and through thick brush with astounding agility. The next, it dropped to all fours, a quadrupedal streak of darkness, its immense speed carrying it through the undergrowth like a predator possessed. The sounds it made were horrifyingly close. The rhythmic thud of its heavy impacts on the frozen ground, each step shaking the very earth. The sickening crack of thick branches snapping under its weight as it tore through the forest, and the piercing, grating sound of its massive claws raking against tree trunks, a primal shriek of metal on wood that echoed with chilling clarity through the night. A constant, terrifying symphony of its pursuit. Thompson, his eyes wide with a manic terror, suddenly broke formation, abandoning our desperate retreat. I can't do this," he screamed, his voice cracking, and he bolted into the deeper woods, away from the trail, away from us, directly into the waiting darkness. Moore cursed, trying to pivot, but it was too late. Gar's shadow detached itself from the trees where Thompson had vanished. A swift, silent grab in the dark, a choked, gurgling scream that was cut brutally short, replaced by the snapping of twigs and the rapid thud of something being dragged into the impenetrable blackness. Thompson was gone, another casualty claimed by the unseen hunters. My heart was a frantic drum hammering against my ribs. We were dwindling. Miller, the newly transformed soldier, was still a threat, though we seemed to be losing him in the chaos. But the larger creature, the master, was still on our flank, toying with us, its movements precise and terrifyingly intelligent. Suddenly, a massive, powerful force slammed into Moore from the side, a fleeting glimpse of dark fur, glowing amber eyes, and immense claws, a guttural snarl. And then Moore's scream, a raw, piercing sound of agony and terror, was abruptly cut off. I spun my light, but it was too late. Only disturbed snow and a fresh, dark stain remained, rapidly disappearing into the deeper woods, dragged by an unseen hand. Moore, our leader, our last bastion of order, was gone. The smell was overwhelming now, suffocating me, making me gag. The acrid stench of fresh meat and hot blood mingled with the powerful, musky odor of marking urine. A territorial declaration from a creature that clearly felt it owned these woods. But beneath it all, and perhaps most disturbingly, was the cloying, unmistakable odor of human sweat, stale and rancid, a ghostly reminder of the humanity still clinging to the beast, or perhaps the scent of the men it had recently consumed. I was alone, or so I thought. Then I heard it, not behind me but above. A faint rustle of branches, too heavy for a squirrel, too precise for a bird. I slowly raised my headlamp, my breath caught in my throat. Two distinct, massive silhouettes, moving with impossible agility, seemed to glide through the treetops, keeping pace with my desperate run. They were watching, observing, waiting. Not just one, not just two, but a whole group. They were multiplying. They had converted the soldiers. They were a pack, intelligent, relentless, and now they had me. The chilling realization solidified into a terrifying certainty. We had stumbled into a nesting ground, a place where these creatures were born and bred, perhaps even where they transformed their victims. The sounds of the creatures, their heavy footsteps, their guttural growls, now echoed with a perverse intelligence. They were communicating, coordinating, herding me towards some unknown, terrifying fate. The night was a living hell, and I was trapped in its core. Alone and terrified, the thud of the creature's impossible steps still echoing in my ears, I ran. The forest was a blur of hostile shadows and icy branches, each one a potential trap, each sound a new wave of terror. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but the primal urge to survive, to escape the suffocating presence of these monstrous hunters, propelled me forward. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to put distance between myself and the unspeakable things that now owned the night. Through sheer luck, or perhaps some lingering, cruel design of the creatures, I stumbled upon it. A small, weathered emergency shelter, a stark, utilitarian box of corrugated metal used by search and rescue teams in extreme conditions. It was a beacon of fragile hope in the overwhelming darkness. I plunged inside, fumbling desperately for the internal locking bars. With a sickening clank, they slid into place, sealing the flimsy door. The silence inside, after the cacophony of the chase, was deafening, broken only by my own ragged, desperate breaths. I slumped against the cold metal wall, my rifle clutched tightly, my eyes darting to the small, reinforced window. Then the sounds began. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the snow outside. They circled the shelter, a relentless, terrifying rhythm. Sometimes they were two distinct, measured thuds, undeniably bipedal, almost human in their cadence. Other times, they sped up, becoming a flurry of four powerful impacts, running, scratching at the frozen earth, circling faster, testing the perimeter. The creatures weren't just outside. They were playing with me. A deep, guttural growl vibrated through the metal walls, so close I could feel it in my teeth. It was the large one, the alpha, its breath misting against the window, though I couldn't bring myself to look. Then another sound, lighter, faster, scrabbling against the roof, as if a smaller, more agile version was scaling the shelter. The chilling realization struck me. They knew I was inside. They weren't trying to break in immediately. They were tormenting me, drawing out my terror. Hours crawled by, an eternity of psychological torment. Every scrape, every growl, every thud outside the flimsy walls was a fresh wave of panic. I sat huddled in the corner, rifle aimed at the door, my finger twitching on the trigger, knowing it was probably futile against whatever force these creatures possessed. Then, the worst sound of all, a whisper, so faint, so insidious, that at first I thought my mind was finally cracking. But it was there, undeniable, just outside the door, impossibly close. "Hey, hey, buddy!" My blood ran cold. It was Moore's voice, unmistakably his. Soft, familiar, laced with an unnerving, almost playful tone. But it wasn't him, it couldn't be. I had seen him taken, heard his scream cut short. This was a cruel, monstrous mimicry, a psychological weapon wielded by something that thought like a human, but hunted like a beast. "Are you in there? We just want to talk." The voice continued, a low, seductive murmur, echoing Moore's cadence perfectly. But behind it, beneath it, I could almost hear the low, wet gurgle of a hidden growl, the promise of fangs and claws. I clapped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, rocking back and forth. "No! You're not him! You're not Moore!" I screamed back, my voice raw, cracking, pathetic against the chilling intelligence of the voice outside. The whispering continued, alternating between Moore's voice and a series of low, guttural snarls, as if the creatures were discussing me, their prey, right outside my pathetic sanctuary. They were toying with me, savoring my fear, enjoying the slow unraveling of my sanity. The hours stretched into an eternity of psychological warfare, the cold seeping into my very soul. But it was the icy breath of terror that truly froze me. I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that these creatures preferred the cloak of darkness. They were hunters of the night, their power amplified by the absence of light. My only hope was the dawn. I just had to survive until then. Just before the first anemic rays of light touched the tops of the tallest trees, breaking the impenetrable blackness, a single long, mournful howl erupted from the forest. It was unlike any animal sound I had ever heard. Not the triumphant howl of a wolf, nor the guttural roar of a bear. It was a sound laced with something almost human, a profound sadness, a haunting lament, a chilling echo of lost humanity. It seemed to emanate from the direction of the clearing where we had found the first transforming soldier, a final, chilling warning that resonated with every fiber of my being. Dawn arrived, not as a glorious savior, but as a hesitant grey infiltration, slowly pushing back the oppressive blackness. The long, mournful howl that had preceded it still echoed in my ears, a chilling, almost human lament that promised no true escape. The sounds of movement outside the shelter had ceased, leaving behind an unnerving silence. I slowly pushed myself up, my muscles stiff with cold and terror, my mind a hazy mess of fragmented nightmares and waking dread. My hands trembled as I unbarred the shelter door, the cold metal a stark reminder of the long, terrifying night. The forest outside was still, cloaked in a fresh layer of frost, but the air still held that pervasive, acrid smell of wet fur, stale sweat and warm blood. It was a smell that had now become synonymous with pure, unadulterated terror. I stepped out, my rifle held at the ready, my eyes scanning the silent, empty landscape. There were no creatures in sight, only their tracks in the freshly fallen snow. Heavy, impossible prints that alternated between bipedal and quadrupedal, circling the shelter, mocking my temporary reprieve. They were gone for now, but their presence was etched into the very fabric of the forest, a lingering curse. The helicopter arrived an hour later, its familiar thumping blades a sound of salvation, yet it brought no comfort. We were half the platoon we had started with. Moore, Thompson, Miller, and 2 others were dead or missing, swallowed by the insatiable hunger of the night. My uniform was torn, my body bruised, my mind shattered. The official report, written by men in warm offices far from the icy embrace of those cursed woods, would state, "wild animal attack." It would talk about large predators, perhaps a rogue bear or a pack of exceptionally aggressive wolves. They would rationalize it, sanitize it, strip it of its true horror. They would never understand. They would never feel the cold breath of impossible creatures, or hear the whisper of a dead man's voice from the shadows. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I know what breathed behind me in that clearing. I know what transformed before my eyes, twisting a man into a snarling beast. And today, after everything, after months of sleepless nights, drenched in cold sweats every time I hear a branch breaking in the woods behind my house, I say without hesitation what I tried to deny throughout the entire operation. We found the missing soldiers, yes, but not to bring them back. We found them at the exact moment they were becoming something impossible, something ancestral, something that walked between forms, something that looked directly at me with hunger and consciousness. We saw what they were becoming. They were turning into werewolves, and I know some of them are still out there, waiting for the right night to finish what began in that damned forest. The timberline hides their secret, a curse whispered on the frozen wind, a primal hunger that will forever haunt my nightmares. If this chilling tale sent shivers down your spine, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more terrifying stories, and leave a comment below. Tell me, what city or country are you watching from? And more importantly, have you ever heard stories of werewolves or strange creatures in your own region? Share your experiences in the comments. Let's see how many of us have faced the unknown.